Before the first drop of rain fell, the world was already broken. Not by men with weapons or kings with cruel hands, but by something older, deeper, and far more dangerous. Heaven itself had cracked. In Ethiopia's forbidden Book of Jubilees, a scripture erased from the Western Bible, you won't just find another version of Genesis. You'll find something more unsettling, a cosmic crisis that began long before the flood. A rebellion in the spiritual realm, a boundary violated between heaven and earth, and a terrifying offspring that tore at the very fabric of creation. The flood, according to Ethiopia's sacred tradition, wasn't simply punishment for human corruption. It was a desperate act of cleansing, not just of wickedness, but of spiritual contamination, a divine emergency. This isn't the Genesis you grew up with. This is Little Genesis, as it's called in Ethiopia, a hidden book once cherished by ancient Jewish scribes, preserved for centuries in the Ge'ez language, and still held sacred by both the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the Beta Israel community. And in this book, the story is different, clearer, darker, and perhaps closer to the truth. Stay with us, because in part 6 of this video, we will explore how the monstrous children of angels, the Nephiliim, survived even after the waters receded. Their bodies may have drowned, but their spirits, they live on, haunting the bloodlines of Noah, creeping into the rituals and laws he left behind. You've heard of Nephilim, but you've never heard what Ethiopia says happened to their souls. So before we dive in, comment below and tell us, do you believe the flood was about justice or about fear? Like this video if you think ancient truths still matter. And subscribe, because the stories you've been told may not be the stories that were meant to survive. When we talk about Genesis, most people think of the familiar beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what if I told you there's another Genesis, one that was erased from the West, but preserved in the mountains of East Africa? In Ethiopia, there exists a sacred book known as the Book of Jubilees. Locally, it's sometimes called Little Genesis. Not because it's smaller, but because it retells the creation story in more detail and with a deeper cosmic structure. Unlike the Genesis we read today, which unfolds like a flowing story, Jubilees is tightly organized. It's structured around 50 cycles, called Jubilees, each lasting 49 years. This isn't just literary technique, it's theology. The very rhythm of time, of history, of sacred law is treated as divine architecture. In this view, time itself is holy. And Ethiopia didn't just preserve this text, they canonized it. While the councils of the Western Church removed books like Enoch and Jubilees from their Bibles, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept them. So did the Beta Israel, the ancient Jewish community of Ethiopia. To this day, they read from Jubilees as scripture. Some scholars believe the Book of Jubilees was first written between 170 and 150 BCE. It likely came from the same community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls we now know included Jubilees in their sacred library. But while other Christian traditions eventually lost the book, Ethiopia translated it into Ge'ez, their sacred liturgical language, as early as the 8th or 9th century. Why did they keep it? Because this book doesn't just tell the story of humanity, it offers a map, a spiritual map, through divine law, feast days, holy calendars, and moral boundaries.
It was especially cherished during times of crisis, like the political upheavals of the Zagwe dynasty or the famine cycles of the 10th century. In chaos, they turned to structure. In uncertainty, they turned to jubilees. And it's not just about timelines and calendars. This book carries something more daring than Genesis itself, because it doesn't just describe creation. It names the forces that tried to unmake it. So stay with me, because what Jubilees reveals next is a rebellion that begins not on earth, but in heaven.
The story we're about to enter is not just about men and women. It's about a fracture in the order of creation itself. In the Book of Jubilees, the flood doesn't begin with human sin. It begins with the sky cracking open. A group of heavenly beings, called the Watchers, descend from their divine realm, not as messengers, not on God's command, but on their own will. They saw the daughters of men, and they wanted them, so they took them. They crossed a line that should never have been crossed. From this forbidden union came the Naphodim, monstrous giants, not just big men, not just warriors. These beings devoured animals and humans. They destroyed crops. They unleashed chaos. And soon, the world itself became infected. The blood of the earth soaked with violence. The air filled with cries not only of pain, but of confusion, because the boundary between the holy and the mortal had been shattered. Now, some early Christian thinkers, like Clement of Alexandria or Augustine, tried to soften this story. They said maybe the Watchers weren't really angels. Maybe they were just descendants of Seth, the righteous son of Adam, and the daughters of men were from the line of Cain. But in Ethiopia, the older tradition was kept. They told it as it was, that these were not just men. They were rebellious spirits, and their children were not meant to exist. The Book of Jubilees and its companion, the Book of Enoch, don't hesitate. They name the names of the angels who fell. They list the sorceries they taught. They describe how the world, once ordered and good, became twisted and dark. This wasn't just a story about lust. It was about spiritual contamination, the kind that spreads like a virus, the kind that calls for a reset, not just punishment. And that's what the flood became, not a storm of wrath, but a flood of mercy, a cleansing of something far more dangerous than evil kings or violent men. It was the undoing of a cosmic rebellion. But even as the skies prepared to weep and the waters began to rise, something else was happening below, because while heaven broke its silence, Noah was listening.
While the world descended into chaos, Noah didn't just build an ark. He built something even more important: a memory, a rhythm, a law. The Book of Jubilees paints a picture of Noah that most of us never hear. Not just a man with hammer and wood, but a spiritual architect, a keeper of sacred time. You see, in Jubilees, the flood isn't just a natural disaster. It's a turning point, a reset button on both the physical world and the moral order. And Noah, surviving that great cosmic storm, steps out of the ark not just as a father to humanity, but as the first priest of a renewed creation. According to Jubilees, he doesn't waste time. He immediately offers sacrifices of purification. He sets down laws. He reestablishes a sacred calendar based not on guesswork or lunar phases, but on divine pattern. A year of 364 days, divided into 4 perfect quarters, each season marked by 13 weeks, echoing the design of heaven itself. These weren't just numbers, they were a declaration that the chaos of the Watchers would never define the future, only divine order would. He instituted the Feast of Weeks, a celebration of covenant and renewal. He taught his sons the law of firstfruits, a way to give back before taking. He forbade the drinking of blood, a reminder that life belongs to God, not man. And all of this, Jubilees tells us, wasn't from Noah's imagination. It came from a lineage of wisdom passed down through Enoch, the ancient scribe of heaven. A chain of memory that stretched from the stars to the soil. Even today, echoes of that structure remain in Ethiopia. Some feast days, some fasting cycles, the liturgical rhythms of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church still carry the pulse of Noah's calendar. But most importantly, Jubilees reminds us that time itself is not neutral. It can be corrupted. It can also be healed. And in Noah's hands, time became sacred again. But just as order was returning to the earth, something unseen began to stir. A lingering consequence of the rebellion. Because not everything had been washed away.
By the time the first raindrop fell, the verdict had already been spoken. But here's what's different in the Book of Jubilees. The flood wasn't just divine judgment, it was a divine rescue. Genesis tells us the world had become violent, but Jubilees goes deeper. It tells us why that violence took root, because the boundary between heaven and earth had been violated. The Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers, were never meant to exist. They poisoned the land, the air, even the animals. And so the flood wasn't just about punishing mankind, it was about healing a universe that had been spiritually infected. And that's why the flood, in this telling, isn't just a chaotic storm. It follows a divine clock, every moment marked with sacred precision. Noah enters the ark on the 17th day of the second month in the 5th week of the 5th year of the 27th Jubilee. The 7 gates of heaven open, the fountains of the deep burst forth, and the waters rise 15 cubits above the highest mountains. Not one detail is random. Not one day is left uncounted. The flood lasts 5 full months. And when the ark finally comes to rest, it doesn't land on Mount Ararat, as Genesis says, but on Mount Lubar, in the land of Ararat. Even that, Jubilees suggests, matters, because names carry weight, and locations carry memory. By the 17th day of the 2nd month in the 7th year, the waters have receded. Noah opens the ark on the 27th day. The world, once drowned, now breathes again. But here's the question Jubilees wants us to ask. Was this a punishment or a cleansing? A wrathful end or a merciful restart? The flood in this telling is not about rage. It's about restoration. It's about cosmic rhythm reasserting itself after chaos tried to rewrite the laws of heaven. And yet, even as the ground dried and the animals scattered, something still lingered, because the children of the Watchers left behind more than bones.
The rain had stopped. The floodwaters were gone. The earth was still. But not everything had been washed away. Because what Jubilees reveals next is something Genesis never tells us. The giants, the Nephilim, had perished in the flood, but their spirits did not. According to the Book of Jubilees and its companion, the Book of Enoch, the offspring of the Watchers were more than flesh. They were part spirit, part human. And when their bodies died in the flood, their spirits became something else entirely. They became demons, wandering, disembodied, hungry for influence, whispering corruption into the hearts of men. And they didn't just linger quietly. They tormented the children of Noah. They twisted thought. They stirred division. They tempted violence. That's why, even after the flood, evil did not disappear. Because evil wasn't only about behavior. It had become a presence. Jubilees tells us that Noah, before his death, gave his sons a final warning. He didn't just teach them to plant vineyards or keep feasts. He taught them how to protect their families from spiritual corruption. He spoke of bloodshed, of idolatry, of unholy mixtures, not only in body, but in spirit. And those warnings echo through Ethiopian tradition to this day, in sacred chants, in ancient exorcism rituals, in scrolls inscribed with Giez prayers designed to bind demons and cast them out. Because in Ethiopia, the story didn't end with the rainbow. It continued in the awareness that some battles are fought in silence, not with swords, but with discernment. And here's where the message becomes uncomfortable. According to Jubilees, the flood was never meant to erase all evil, only to reset the stage. The real war, the spiritual one, was still ahead. So the question becomes, if the Watcher's offspring survived in spirit, where are they now? And more importantly, how did Ethiopia remember what the rest of the world forgot?
When the rest of the world edited the Bible, Ethiopia kept the pages that others feared. While councils in the West debated what belonged and what did not, in the highlands of East Africa, the story stayed whole. Jubilees, Enoch, the Watchers, the Nephilims, all of it preserved not as myth, but as spiritual memory. Why? Because in Ethiopia, Scripture wasn't just theology. It was identity. It was resistance. It was survival. The Book of Jubilees became more than a sacred story. It became a mirror for times of national crisis. When rulers fell, when drought struck, when foreign powers threatened their land, the people turned to this ancient text because they understood something the West forgot, that history moves in patterns. And sometimes, when the world descends into chaos, it's not just politics or economics, it's a spiritual imbalance. Ethiopian scribes, some in remote mountain monasteries, hand-copied the Book of Jubilees in Ge'ez for centuries. They decorated its pages with illuminations, drawings of angels falling, giants rising, and Noah offering sacrifice. These manuscripts weren't locked away. They were read aloud during feasts. They were sung in churches. They were memorized by children. Even today, you can still hear echoes of these stories in the liturgical chants of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Chants that mourn the fall of the Watchers, that warn of the Nephilim, and that call on God to cleanse not just the body, but the spirit. Meanwhile, in much of the Christian world, these books were cast aside, labeled apocrypha, dangerous, unorthodox, too strange. But Ethiopia knew that strange doesn't mean false, and forgotten doesn't mean irrelevant. In fact, sometimes the stories we reject are the ones that hold the key to what's really happening now. Because if the ancient flood wasn't just a punishment, but a pattern, then maybe what we're living through today
isn't just politics, it's prophecy. And maybe, just maybe, the reason we feel the world shifting under our feet is because the old watchers never truly left.
So now we return to the question we asked at the beginning. Was the flood judgment, or was it rescue? In Ethiopia's ancient memory, the answer was always both. It was justice for a world that had lost its way, but it was also mercy for the world that would come after. A reset not only of earth, but of time, of law, of spirit. And while much of the world moved on, forgetting the watchers, ignoring the Naphodim, and burying the warnings of Noah, Ethiopia remembered. In songs, in scrolls, in silence. And now, as we look around at a world once again trembling at the edges, we have to ask ourselves, are we watching another flood begin? Not with water, but with confusion and fear and the erasing of boundaries once called sacred. Maybe these old stories weren't just myths. Maybe they were maps. Maps that warned us what starts in heaven always ends on earth. So now it's your turn. Tell us in the comments, do you think the watchers are still among us? If not in body, then in spirit? Like this video if you believe ancient wisdom should never be silenced. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to rediscover the stories the world tried to erase. Because what's been forgotten was never meant to be lost.